Okay, let's get started for this Tuesday, the 28th of October. Welcome to today's Frontier Opening Bell. Oreoluwa Odetunde from Greenwich Merchant Bank. Thank you, Oreoluwa, in charge of macroeconomics. Good morning.
Good morning, Blessing. Thank you for
Thank
having me.
you. It's good to have you alongside Onyeka Ejoma, who is in charge of industrial goods analysis at Vectiva Capital Management. Thank you. Good morning.
Good morning, Blessing. It's a pleasure to be here.
Very grateful. Let's get the show started. Not a particularly positive Monday for the global stock markets. China came in with 4.9% third quarter GDP numbers. The European markets and the US were a lot more concerned about the coronavirus and the stimulus fight between the Democrats and the Republicans. And that sought to flow into a bit into emerging markets, but South Africa, Kenya, Ivory Coast, and a few other markets in Africa, in North Africa, Tunisia, managed to escape that. They finished off in the positive territory. Egyptian market finished 0.12%. Nigeria was flat. So that's just gives you a sense of where we finished off on African markets on Monday. But let's look at the East African space. The new currency by Ethiopia is bringing more Ethiopians into the banking system. Looks like a very smart way by the authorities to get more folks into the banking system, additional 1 million Ethiopians. Kenya's Trans-Century cuts its commercial banks' debt by 40%, rejig the tenor from between 5 and 10%. It's a whole way of trying to reposition this company. KenGen would now be paying taxes after the new Finance Act by the Kenyatta's administration says there is no exemption to any government agencies in paying tax. Uganda's Opportunity Bank is selling about 50% stake to a UK entity, and Mauritius Accord Development posts a profit of 5 million rupees at half year, and Uganda is set to list on the Dar es Salaam Stock Exchange. Final touches to this particular development in Uganda is going to be another listing for this telco giant on the African continent. Let's look at the Nigerian and West African markets. It's all about the protests, the earnings, and what impact will be on inflation and GDP if the protests, end SARS protests, and police brutality now morphing into a bigger quest for good governance in Nigeria. Lagos has ordered schools to be closed from today. Offices are asking some workers to do fewer hours. A lot of folks are now back into remote working. Double One PLC, formerly Mobil Oil, is exiting the Nigerian Stock Exchange. The shareholders sign off on the announcement that was made earlier in the year by this oil retailer, a big one in Nigeria. By the way, Vista Bank is buying two subsidiaries of PNB Paribas in Burkina Faso and in Guinea. They're expanding their footprints across West Africa on the back of the AFCFTA. And of course, in Nigeria, hybrid solar power plant, 19 megawatts, is getting the attention of the India's Sterling and Wilson company. Let me start with Onyeka when it comes to the protest. Everyone is talking about how this will impact us moving forward. This is one big story we cannot ignore.
Yes, Blessing. This has been the headline news in the Nigerian market for the past 2 weeks now. We've seen young people and people of all ages actually come out to protest against police brutality and police accountability in Nigeria, in a protest that has now morphed to even include, protests against bad governance and just general accountability of the ruling class over the citizens in Nigeria. We've had, in terms of the economic impact, we've had the protesters block major roads at major toll gates in Lagos and across other parts of Nigeria, and this has had an impact on transportation, on logistics, and just generally, trade and people looking to go about their daily activities. There has certainly been a disruption, and it potentially has a likely impact on inflation as given as the challenges of logistics might drive up food prices, might also have an impact on earnings of certain groups that depend on physical distribution and logistics, in the fourth quarter, depending on how long these protests last. But we need to balance that against the cost of police brutality and bribery in Nigeria. And this is not anecdotal, but also data released by the National Bureau of Statistics, which has done a survey of Nigerians in two of the past 4 years. We have seen we've seen that according to them, around 117 million Nigerians had to have paid bribes, in the last 4 years, like every year in the last 4 years, and this translates to around 1.1, a bribe paid by 1.1 adults every single year, with um, a cash figure of around 675 billion naira, which is around 5,000 over 5,000 naira per bribe paid, and the overwhelming majority of these bribes goes to the Nigerian police force, especially the rogue SARS unit. According to the National Bureau of Statistics, around a third of Nigerians who have encountered the police, every year, pays bribes at least 4 times a year, with the average bribe figures, you know, actually going up. It does have an economic impact on Nigerians, and beyond that, it also goes further because we agree that maintaining the rule of law is important to the economic development of the country, and the police is a major unit that is responsible for doing that. Now, when bribes and kickbacks, or the general term anything for the boys, is used as a substitute for due process, we get into a position where we get into a poverty trap where only the wealthy can afford to do certain types of businesses, as they are the only ones who can afford the cost of bribes, as well as the cost of operating those businesses, which typically tend to be off balance sheet items.
Yeah.
So while we're looking at the economic impacts, the short-term, negative economic impact of the protest on logistics and companies' earnings and inflation, we should also be balancing it out with the potential or possible, um, you know, positives that can come from the process, which will be in reducing these, issues that Nigerians have to face.
I agree with you. It has to be balanced. The balance will have to come because if you talk about 600 billion, that's a whole lot of money. If you put that into the energy sector or education or healthcare or even insecurity across the food basket and all of that, I'm sure it will make a whole lot of dent if they judiciously used or if we put it into infrastructure. By the way, it's quite a whole pile of money, even by today's exchange rate. I'm sure you agree, Oreoluwa, that 600 billion, if you put that down in cash, it's going to take a whole lot of caterpillars or trailers to load it.
Oh, yes, yes, definitely. We do agree with this. I mean, the protest is taking a whole different turn, like Onyeka mentioned earlier, and there's this level of uncertainty that we're seeing. Like, I mean, how long is this going to last? I mean, we're 3 weeks into the fourth quarter. So, probably a negotiation, a fast negotiation from, the presidency will, further put things in place. And we might not really be able to see this effect advance more than it would. And, economic activities will not be seriously distorted like we, maybe envisage that it might probably be, So, but another thing that we were looking at, as far as the earnings were concerned for some of all these corporates, was that I think some of them would have been able to look at their books on and how they will better operate when there is an economic shock. I mean, we did see what happened during the coronavirus pandemic, and it was an economic shock totally to a lot of all these firms. But I think now they've been able to build on their resiliency. So, they should be able to upskill operations in some way. And, if the level of effect of, downturn we might see in economic activities might not, be so massive, compared to what we've seen, in the second quarter, to be specific. So, as I know, Inka had mentioned earlier, transportation expense, we expect that, components in the sub components of the core basket to, invariably affect food inflation, on one end. So you have security on one end and being, heightened level of insecurity. And when we have a heightened level of insecurity, it also affects it affects supply side constraints of 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 food, especially. So yes, so these factors, but it does depend. Like I said, it depends on on how long this protest will go on for. What is the reaction of the government to the demand of the youth?
I agree that something needs to be done and be done very quickly. I'm sure the government had, even before the protest, a mountain of list of reforms that should be carried out. Even without the reform ab initio, there have been a lot of calls for fiscal reforms, to do a lot of economic reform, reform the judiciary, reform the police had been there for many years, reform the economic management, reform the economic team, reform the parastatals and government agencies, reform the NNPC. So I'm sure the shelf is loaded with so many reports that have been calling for reforms, even in the electricity sector, for example, and all of that, that we haven't really, the government had in touch. And I think they can take a cue from this one now that it's become a protest, to hit the ground running. Like Oyeka will put it, the political will that is needed. It's going to take a whole lot of deconstruct. I think for Nigeria, really, there are a lot of comfortable areas before that need to change, and at the National Assembly, across states, House of Assemblies, and all of that. Okay, let's squeeze in the Southern African market. We'll ask you a bit more about the Nigerian market week, but let's look at the capex replacement investment that BNP Paribas South Africa says is not enough for this advanced economy to have meaningful growth. This is coming just as we're expecting the latest 2020-2021 budget by the National Treasury in Pretoria. Capitex and Easy Equities are joining together in South Africa to offer share trading in South Africa and the US via an app. How this will work is all about fintech, by the way. Omnia Holdings is selling its oral agribusiness to Ruvensa for $146.9 million. That's in the agribusiness scale. South Africa is still pursuing its nuclear energy, 2,500 megawatts. That has gotten the interest of the IDFC, which is a DFI company. And Zimbabwe is moving on to set up or to start operating its second stock exchange in the next couple of days. But between now and Friday, there's going to have the first opening bell on the stock exchange in Victoria Falls. Onyeka, let's get back to the Nigerian market space, and I'm looking at what the sectors you're looking at, for example, that could be of interest to investors now that we have this protest on our hands.
Okay, thank you very much, person. Much like the lockdown measures that were initiated to control the spread of the coronavirus pandemic in Nigeria, the protests have, um, due to the lockdowns of certain key roads, have also, forced workers to consider working from home again, as well as students to continue to, learn from
From
home,
home, yeah.
from home again. And I see that, it makes sense to look at what happened in the second quarter due to the coronavirus pandemic, as a precursor for what to expect, in this fourth quarter, given the significant similarities, between the two scenarios. And in these cases, we see that the sectors that thrived in the second quarter were the financial services sector and the telecommunications sectors, as we saw that, you know because of the work from home measures implemented, there was a lot more demand for access and data services. Um, in the financial services space, we saw a shift towards digital banking, which was positive on two legs for many of the traditional banks and many of the fintech houses also, because it's digital banking not only has a wider reach in terms of services, but it also reduces the cost of banking for the banks. So on two folds, it does have a positive impact on the financials of the banks. And so if we're using the Q2 um, templates, I believe that investors will be looking more at financial services and telecommunications once more.
Okay, so Orelua, asking you about that story about capital expenditure, replacement investments that can drive growth. So if you look at Nigeria, for example, do you think we're doing much better than South Africa, for example, when you look at how government is spending into investments in infrastructure replacements using our capex and looking at the current and the next year budget?
Well, so looking at the capex, it wasn't compared to what we've seen. I mean, what we saw for what was proposed for the 2021 budget was, better than what we've seen for the previous years. So we are seeing, yes, the government is going into that line of, increasing capital expenditure and looking at how it will help infrastructural development in the economy. I think compared to South Africa, there's still that gap. We've seen that they have gotten to a certain level of development, and based on their operations, we still see that there's still a very high level of deficiency in the Nigerian economy. Something that is being, yes, it's being worked on, but we always have that problem of implementations. There's this allocations that have been being made to some of all these projects, but going thus far, what have you seen so far? So implementation, the lack of transparency, accountability, has really affected, you know, um, our own implementations of some of these projects. So yes, it might not be a basis so much of a comparison, but I think we're getting there with time.
Okay, I think it's a work on. I think with on this side, we think it's a work in progress. But again, we need to talk about the private sector very quickly. But let's just touch on North Africa very quickly before we finish up with the Nigerian story, which is the main focus today with the protests that we have on our hands. I think they say, as they put it, charity begins at home. So Egyptian Gulf Bank is planning to raise capital, $32.1 million to $422.7 million. That's quite huge. If you consider the consolidation within that space, the central bank in Egypt signed off on the merger between Faisal Bank of Bahrain to Itma Bank, and the UAE-based ADQ has designed an acquisition of Amon in Egypt. And foreign investment inflows into Tunisia dipped about 26.4% in the month to September. Maroc Telecom, which is the country's uh, big player in the telecommunications sector, says its 9 months revenue increases 0.7% within the period under review. Let's take some quick final words from both of you. Onyeka, in terms of how do you think the private sector play into the current ongoing protest? I haven't heard anything much about that.
Thank you, Basim. I think that, different stakeholders, both across the public and the private sector, needs to lend their voice and need to lend their support, whether in terms of donations or whether in terms of just speaking out. The private sector has also had significant, progress in terms of lobbying the current in terms of lobbying, the public sector administrations. They have this experience with lobbying and pushing through policies that favor them. This is one. Police accountability and general political accountability is, the push is something that would favor pretty much everyone, including the private sector, and it's something that should also be lobbied. And on the part of the individuals and the on part of the individuals, we see people, going on the streets, amplifying the voices on social media and also donating. Um, I think all hands need to be on deck, and if the private sector steps in, also doing the same thing, whether amplifying on their social media, donating, and also, going through the back end by lobbying, the political, the ruling class, to push through these reforms. I believe that there will be significant change. So it's just about everyone, pushing in and chipping in the best way that they can. But yes, we've already seen the private sector step in. On the protest grounds, we see different companies coming to support the protesters, whether it's by donating food, whether it's by donating water, or bringing in key things to ensure that the fire of the protests continue. And we expect that the private sector will continue to be leading voices in this.
Okay, thank you, Onyeka. Finally, Oreluwa, do you think the protest may bite into inflation if this continues a little bit longer for October?
Oh yes, yes, we do expect it to bite into inflation. I mean, yes, we still have the underlying cost pressures on inflation. So I mean, we expect that yes, this will definitely be affecting transportation linkages, and it would also be affecting food inflation on its own, which was already on the rise. So an upsurge in the cost of components, filtering into food items, the cost of food items would definitely put an offshoot to inflationary pressures.
Okay, let's leave it there for this morning. Thank you to both of you, Onyeka Ejoma at Vertiba Capital Management and Oreluwa Odetunde. Thank you for being on Frontier Open Bell. I have boosted number. I will see you again tomorrow, Wednesday.